The day seemed like any other. The sunlight shone through the tall windows of the courtroom, and the air smelled of old wood and paper. There were whispers in the room, the usual quiet hum of people waiting. Most of the people in the courtroom looked tired. They had been there for days, weeks, even months. The trial had dragged on for so long that it felt like it would never end. But for Malik Johnson, it wasn't just another ordinary day. Today was the day that could change everything. Malik stood at the front of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He was only 14 years old, but his determination made him seem older. His brown eyes scanned the courtroom, the place that had caused his family so much pain. His family had been waiting for this day for years, hoping that justice would finally be served. But it was more than just a hope. Today, it was up to him. The courtroom was full of people, most of them adults who thought they knew how this would go. They didn't know Malik. They didn't know what he was capable of. His family had been treated unfairly for so long, and now, Malik was going to do something about it. There was a heavy feeling in the room. People were tired of hearing the same things over and over. The trial had been going on for what seemed like forever, and everyone had grown impatient. But that wasn't what was on Malik's mind. He had a job to do, and nothing would stop him. He wasn't just here for himself. He was here for his mother. His father. For his entire family. They had suffered enough. The judge, a man named Judge Blackwell, was sitting at the front of the room, his face stern and serious. His eyes were tired, and he seemed to be in a hurry to finish the case. He wasn't paying attention to the boy in front of him, not really. To him, Malik was just another child in a courtroom full of grown ups. Another child who would soon leave the room, and another case that would eventually come to an end. But Malik wasn't just another child. He was more than that. And soon, everyone in the room would know it. Malik's mother sat in the audience, watching him closely. She had been through so much in her life. She had worked hard to raise Malik, doing everything she could to give him a better life. She had seen her husband, Malik's father, suffer for something he didn't do. And she had watched as their family was torn apart by lies and unfairness. She had always believed in Malik. She had always known he was special. But she never imagined that her son would be the one to stand up and change everything. Her eyes met Malik's. She could see the determination in his face. She gave him a small nod, just a simple movement of her head. It was all the encouragement he needed. He wasn't just fighting for his family anymore. He was fighting for something bigger. Malik looked at the judge again, trying to calm his nerves. This was it. The moment that would change everything. The judge cleared his throat and looked down at the papers in front of him. He was ready to finish this trial. He had heard enough. He was tired of all the talking, tired of the back and forth between the lawyers. Nothing seemed to surprise him anymore. He just wanted to move on to the next case. But that was when Malik spoke. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. His voice, small but strong, broke through the quiet of the courtroom. "I know the truth," Malik said. His words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Everyone in the room turned to look at him. The judge looked up, his eyebrows furrowing in confusion. No one had expected this. Malik's heart raced, but he stood tall. He wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't going to let the lies continue. He wasn't going to let the people who had hurt his family get away with it. "I know who did it," he said, his voice a little stronger this time. The room was silent. Even the judge seemed taken aback. Malik's mother held her breath. She had always known that Malik had a gift. He had a way of seeing things that others missed. But she never thought that her son would be the one to take on the people who had hurt them. The prosecutor, Mr. Douglas, who had been sitting at the front of the room, looked at Malik with disbelief. He had been the one to make the case against Malik's father. He had been the one who had twisted the facts and told lie after lie to the jury. He was the one who had done everything to make sure Malik's family stayed in the dark. But now, Malik was standing there, looking directly at him. "You did it," Malik said again, this time louder, clearer. Douglas scoffed, trying to hide his nervousness behind a smile. "What are you talking about, boy?" he asked, trying to dismiss Malik's words. "This is not a game." But Malik didn't back down. "I know what you did. And I can prove it." The tension in the room was thick. Everyone was watching. Malik could feel the eyes of the judge, the lawyers, and even the jury on him. But he didn't look away. He wasn't afraid anymore. His hand shook slightly as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. He held it up for everyone to see. It was a contract, a piece of paper that should not have been there. It was something no one had expected to find. And it was proof of the truth. Malik took a deep breath and stepped forward, his voice steady as he spoke. "This contract is proof that Mr. Douglas lied. He's the one who caused all of this. He's the one who made sure my father was blamed for a crime he didn't commit. And now, I'm going to make sure the truth is known." The room was still. No one moved. It was like the whole world had stopped spinning for just a moment. The judge stared at Malik, his expression changing. For the first time, Malik saw something in the judge's eyes. It wasn't the cold indifference that had been there before. It wasn't the look of someone who was ready to dismiss him. It was something else, something like respect. Malik stood his ground, not backing down. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was someone who had found the truth, someone who was strong enough to fight for it. And in that moment, the world around him seemed to change. The room remained silent. It was as though time had stopped for a moment, and all eyes were on Malik. He was only 14, but at that moment, he carried a weight much greater than anyone could have imagined. His hands were trembling slightly, but his voice was strong. Every word he spoke was filled with purpose. He wasn't just a boy standing in a courtroom anymore. He was someone who had discovered the truth and was willing to face whatever came next. The judge, who had been staring down at the papers in front of him just moments ago, now looked up, his eyes fixed on Malik. His face was no longer indifferent. It had softened, and for a moment, it seemed like he was seeing Malik in a new light. The usual stern, unshakable judge was nowhere to be found. Now, there was a sense of curiosity, even caution, in his gaze. Malik didn't let the judge's shift in demeanor make him falter. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't just here to speak the truth for himself. He was here for his father, who had been wrongfully accused of a crime he didn't commit. He was here for his mother, who had cried herself to sleep night after night, praying for justice that never seemed to come. He was here for his entire family, who had been swept up in a web of lies spun by people they trusted. Malik had seen enough. It was time to end it. Douglas, the prosecutor, who had been so confident just moments ago, now appeared shaken. His smile faltered, and his posture stiffened. It was clear that Malik's words had caught him off guard. No one had expected this. No one had expected a child to be the one to bring the truth to light. Douglas opened his mouth to speak, but Malik didn't give him a chance. "You think you can hide the truth forever," Malik said, his voice steady and firm. "You think that because you're an adult, you can get away with anything. But you're wrong. I know what you did. And I have the proof to show everyone that you're the one who lied." Douglas' eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze now. His confident facade was starting to crack, and Malik could see it. Malik knew he was getting to him. He had to keep pushing forward. "Malik, you don't know what you're saying," Douglas tried to warn him, his voice shaking. "You can't just make accusations like that without evidence. You can't." "I have evidence," Malik cut him off, holding up the contract in his hand for everyone to see. This is the contract that proves you knew my father was innocent all along. This is the contract that shows you've been lying to everyone in this room. And now, you're going to have to answer for it. The room was still. No one moved. Everyone was waiting, unsure of what would happen next. Malik's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure what the next step would be, but he couldn't back down now. He had already come too far. The truth had to come out. The judge finally spoke, his voice grave but not unkind. "Mr. Johnson, what is this contract? Where did you find it?" Malik felt a surge of relief. It wasn't much, but the fact that the judge was asking about the contract meant that the story was no longer being dismissed. His voice, though still nervous, grew stronger as he began to explain. "It's a contract between Mr. Douglas and someone in my father's business. It was meant to keep my father from speaking the truth about a deal that had gone wrong. They tried to use him to cover up their mistakes. But my father never agreed to it. He was framed. And I can prove it." Malik paused for a moment, scanning the room to make sure everyone was listening. His mother's eyes were wide with hope, her hands trembling as she clutched her seat. His father had been trapped in a lie for years, but now, the chance to clear his name was finally here. The judge nodded slowly. "I see," he said. He was still looking at Malik, and there was a hint of something in his expression that Malik couldn't quite place. Was it respect? Or was it doubt? The judge's face remained stoic, but his mind was clearly working. Malik could see that the wheels were turning. "I want to see that contract," the judge said firmly. "And I want to hear from the defense. This trial is far from over, and we need to be sure of everything before we make any decisions." Malik nodded, his pulse racing. This was his chance. The court had never been willing to listen before, but now, the truth was on the table. He could feel the tension in the air, but there was also a sense of anticipation, as if everyone in the room knew something big was about to happen. The room, which had once seemed so cold and unfriendly, now felt like it was holding its breath. He handed the contract to the judge, careful to keep his hands steady. As the judge examined it, Malik turned to look at his mother. She was smiling, a small, hopeful smile that reached her eyes. For the first time in so long, Malik saw a glimmer of hope in her face. She had been fighting for this day for years, but now, with Malik standing strong, it felt like that hope might finally be rewarded. The judge looked up from the contract, his brow furrowed as he processed what he had seen. "This contract is concerning," he said. "But I need more than just a piece of paper. Mr. Douglas, do you have an explanation for this?" Douglas, who had been quiet for a few moments, seemed to realize that his position had shifted. His face grew pale, and his eyes darted nervously toward the defense attorney, who stood beside him. The defense attorney, a tall man with a serious expression, stepped forward. "Your Honor, this contract is not what it appears to be," the defense attorney said, trying to regain control of the situation. "It is simply a misunderstanding. We have seen many false documents presented in this trial, and this one is no different." But Malik wasn't about to let them twist the truth. "It's not a misunderstanding," he said firmly. "I know what this contract means, and I know what it proves. You can't lie about it anymore. I'm not going to let you." The room was buzzing with whispers again. The prosecutor, the defense attorney, and the judge were all speaking at once, but Malik couldn't hear them. He could only hear the sound of his own heartbeat, pounding in his ears. His mother's face was still full of hope, and his father, who had been sitting quietly until now, was watching him with a proud, almost relieved look on his face. The judge raised his hand, signaling for silence. "Enough," he said firmly. "Mr. Johnson, you've made your case. But we will need time to review everything. I'll be calling a recess. In the meantime, I suggest everyone take a moment to collect themselves. Malik nodded, his legs feeling weak beneath him. He had done it. He had stood up and told the truth. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a chance. The judge stood up and left the room, signaling the beginning of the recess. Malik could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him, but he didn't look away. He had fought for his family, and he had done what no one thought possible. Now, all he could do was wait. But waiting was the hardest part. He had opened the door to the truth, but would they walk through it? Would they finally see what he saw? Would they finally give his father the justice he deserved? The next few moments felt like hours. Malik's thoughts raced as he looked at his parents. His mother was smiling at him, but there was a nervousness in her eyes. His father's face was calm, but Malik knew he was thinking the same thing. The fight wasn't over yet. For years, Malik's family had been caught in a whirlwind of unfairness and corruption. Every day was a struggle, every moment spent in fear, and every step forward seemed to push them back 2 steps. It all started with his father, David Johnson, who had been falsely accused of a crime he never committed. They had tried to live their lives in peace, but the world wasn't kind to them. People who should have believed in his father's innocence didn't. Instead, they turned their backs on him, allowing lies and deceit to shape their reality. Malik's father was a hard-working man. He had always done his best to provide for his family. But one day, without warning, everything changed. The accusation was made, and suddenly, David was a criminal in the eyes of the law. The charge was serious, a charge that could send someone away for a long time, even if they were innocent. Malik's father had never even been near the crime scene. He hadn't even known the victim. But that didn't matter to those in power. They had decided his fate long before any evidence was presented. In the beginning, they thought it would be easy. They thought that once they presented the truth, the lies would be exposed, and everything would go back to normal. But that's not how the system worked. From the very first day in court, it became clear that they were fighting a battle that was rigged from the start. The courtroom, Malik soon realized, was not a place for truth. It was a place for power. The prosecution seemed to have all the resources, all the support, and all the backing of the system. Every word they spoke was designed to paint Malik's father as guilty, even though there was no real evidence against him. They twisted the facts. They manipulated the truth. And the jury, who were supposed to be impartial, looked at Malik's father as though he were already guilty. The way they stared at him, as if they could see something dark in his soul, was enough to make anyone feel small. But Malik's father was stronger than that. He didn't let their eyes weigh him down. He didn't let the whispers from the jury or the scorn from the prosecution make him doubt his own innocence. But it was hard. It was so hard to stand there every day and feel like the world was against him. And Malik could see the toll it was taking on his father. Every day, he grew more tired, more frustrated, more defeated. But he still fought. He never stopped fighting for his family, for Malik, for the truth. But Malik had seen the way the system worked. He had seen how the courtroom was stacked against his father. The prosecution didn't care about the truth. They cared about winning. They cared about making sure their story was the one people believed, even if it wasn't the truth. They used every trick in the book to make sure that their case looked strong, even if it wasn't. And then there was Judge Blackwell. Judge Blackwell was a man who seemed to care about nothing except getting the case over with. He was always in a hurry, always ready to move on to the next trial. To him, this case wasn't about justice. It was about efficiency. He didn't have time for distractions, and certainly not for children who thought they understood the law. Malik had been in the courtroom many times, but each time he had watched Judge Blackwell with growing frustration. It was clear that the judge didn't care about fairness. He cared about getting things done quickly. And the people who were most affected by his decisions were the ones who had the least power to fight back. When Malik first stood up in the courtroom, his voice had trembled. He was scared. He was just a 14-year-old boy, and he knew that his words might not carry any weight in such an important place. But there was something in his heart that wouldn't let him stay silent. There was a fire burning inside of him, a deep sense of injustice that he couldn't ignore. He knew that his family was being wronged, and he couldn't just sit there and watch it happen. At first, the judge had looked at him with nothing but annoyance. His cold, calculating eyes bore down on Malik as if he were an inconvenience. To Judge Blackwell, Malik was just another child who didn't understand how the world worked. He wasn't even looking at him as a person. He was looking at him like he was something beneath him, someone whose words didn't matter. Children were not supposed to speak in his courtroom. They were to be seen, not heard. And that's how Malik felt every time he walked into that room. Like he was invisible. Like his voice didn't matter. But Malik wasn't just any child. His whisper, barely audible at first, had escaped his lips. "This isn't just a case," he had said. "It's a fight for the truth." At that moment, his words had been small, almost lost in the sea of voices in the courtroom. Most people had not paid attention. The lawyers kept arguing. The judge kept flipping through his papers. No one cared about a boy's whisper. But the judge had heard him. Malik wasn't sure if it was the way he said it or if there was something in his voice that made the words stand out. But Judge Blackwell's eyes had narrowed ever so slightly, and for just a moment, Malik could feel the judge's attention shift toward him. There was something in that look. A flicker of recognition. Something in the judge's gut told him that Malik knew more than he should. That something was off. And in that moment, Malik realized that he wasn't invisible. He wasn't the child in the room anymore. He was a part of something bigger. Malik's heart had raced in his chest. He had spoken those words, and now he had to make them count. He knew that the road ahead was long and hard, but he wasn't afraid. He had to stand up for what was right. He had to fight for his father, for his family, and for the truth. But why was Malik so sure? Why was he so confident that this moment would change everything? Malik wasn't sure how he knew, but he felt it deep inside. It was like an instinct, a gut feeling. He had watched the lies and the injustice for so long that now, he could see through them. He knew what had happened. He knew that his father had been framed. He knew that the system, the people in charge, had done everything they could to bury the truth. And now, it was his turn to bring it into the light. But there were so many obstacles in his way. The courtroom was full of people who didn't want the truth to come out. The jury, the prosecution, and even Judge Blackwell, none of them wanted to listen. They wanted to believe the lies. They wanted to believe that David Johnson was guilty. And they would do anything to make that happen. But Malik wasn't afraid of them. He wasn't afraid of the system. He had seen too much to back down now. As the trial dragged on, Malik's frustration grew. Every day felt like a battle, but the truth was always just out of reach. His father, who had already been through so much, was growing more tired. The stress was taking its toll on him. He didn't show it, but Malik could see it in his eyes. He could hear it in his voice. But Malik knew that his father wasn't alone. He had his family by his side. And no matter how many lies were thrown at them, they were going to keep fighting. Each day, as the case continued, Malik saw more of the corruption that ran deep in the system. He saw how easy it was for powerful people to get away with their lies. He saw how the system was designed to protect those in charge and punish those who had no voice. And that was when he realized something: the fight wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about something bigger. It was about a system that needed to change. It was about fighting for the truth, even when it seemed impossible. But how could one boy change something so big? How could Malik, who was just a child in the eyes of the law, make a difference? He didn't know the answer yet. But he knew that he couldn't stay silent. He knew that this was his moment. And he was ready to take it. As the trial dragged on, Malik began to feel the weight of the courtroom press down on him. The air seemed thick with tension, and every day, the case grew more complicated. But Malik wasn't just another observer in the courtroom. He had an eye for details, an instinct that told him something wasn't right. He paid attention to everything: how people moved, what they said, the way they looked at each other. Even the smallest gestures and silent exchanges between the attorneys didn't escape him. He noticed when someone was uncomfortable, when they tried to hide something, when they flinched at a question or avoided eye contact. It was in those moments that Malik knew something wasn't adding up. He saw it in Mr. Douglas, the prosecutor. The man was smug, too sure of himself, convinced that the case was as good as closed. Every time Mr. Douglas stood up to speak, he had this arrogant look on his face, like he already knew the outcome. He believed that he had all the answers, that the trial was just a formality. To him, Malik's father, David, was just a man to convict. He didn't see a person, a father, a family who had been wronged. He only saw a guilty man and the chance to win. But Malik wasn't fooled. He could see beyond the surface. He knew that the truth wasn't as clear as everyone seemed to think. He had been watching every word, every piece of evidence. His mind raced as the trial continued, picking up small things that others missed. He could feel the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift, like they were on the edge of revealing something huge. But no one was connecting the dots. No one seemed to be asking the right questions. It wasn't just the things people said. It was the things they didn't say. The way the attorneys whispered behind their hands, speaking in low voices when they thought no one was listening. Malik had learned to read people's body language. He could tell when someone was hiding something. And those little moments told him that the people in charge of the trial were hiding something too. Malik began to focus on the evidence. At first, it seemed like there wasn't much to go on. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no real proof that his father had committed the crime. But something didn't feel right. Why were key witnesses never called to the stand? Why was the defense team not questioning the timeline more closely? Why was there a lack of documents, crucial ones that could clear his father's name? Why was so much being left unsaid? As the days passed, Malik became more determined. His questions weren't just about the case anymore, they were about the way everything was happening. He had started to notice patterns, things that didn't add up. One day, as he sat in the courtroom, he saw something that made him pause. It was small, barely noticeable, but Malik knew it meant something. The defense attorney had been reading through a document when his hand froze. His eyes flicked nervously across the page, and then he quickly glanced up at the prosecutor, Mr. Douglas. It was brief, just a moment, but it was enough for Malik to notice. The defense attorney's nervous reaction wasn't a coincidence. He was hiding something. But what? Malik's heart began to beat faster as his mind raced. He could feel the truth slipping just out of reach. But the more he observed, the more certain he became that there was something huge at play. Something the adults in the room were missing. Something they were ignoring. One evening, when Malik was at home, he stayed up late to go over his notes. His mom had always told him to keep track of everything, even the small details. She had always believed in him, even when he felt unsure. She said that sometimes, the truth is hidden in plain sight, and you just need to look carefully to find it. With a pencil in his hand and a stack of papers in front of him, Malik went over the transcripts of the trial again. He reread the questions asked by both the defense and prosecution, the statements made by the witnesses, and the objections raised by the attorneys. He marked anything that seemed out of place. And then, After hours of rereading, he found it. There was a small inconsistency in the testimony of one of the witnesses. It wasn't big, but it was there. A detail that didn't make sense. The witness had been asked about the time he saw Malik's father near the crime scene. The witness said that David had been walking down the street at exactly 9 p.m. But when Malik checked the details of the case, he found that the witness had been arrested for lying to the police just months before. He'd even been caught in several different lies. The witness had a history of dishonesty, and yet, no one seemed to question his story. This was the breakthrough Malik needed. He had found something that no one else had. The testimony was a lie. But the question was, why had no one noticed? Why hadn't the defense lawyer pointed it out? Why hadn't the prosecutor investigated further? Malik couldn't shake the feeling that this was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. But now, he had something to work with. It wasn't much yet, but it was a start. The next day, Malik kept his eyes on the witness stand, watching carefully for any more signs of deception. The trial continued as usual, but Malik couldn't help but feel that something important was coming. He could feel the tension building inside him, and the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous things became. He was just a boy in a courtroom full of adults, and yet, he knew he was closer to uncovering something they didn't want anyone to find. He couldn't let go now. He couldn't stop asking questions, even if it meant getting into trouble. Even if it meant facing danger. Because he knew that if he didn't, his father would be convicted of something he didn't do. And that was something Malik couldn't let happen. But the more questions he asked, the more he realized how deep the corruption went. There were people in the courtroom who didn't want the truth to come out. People who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. They had already manipulated the evidence, twisted the facts, and silenced the people who could have helped. Malik had seen enough to know that they would do whatever it took to keep their lies hidden. And that's when Malik made a decision. He couldn't let anyone stop him. He couldn't let fear hold him back. He had to keep going. He had to keep pushing for the truth, no matter what it took. As the trial continued, Malik's discoveries grew more significant. He uncovered more small lies, more missing documents, more inconsistencies in the stories being told. But with each revelation, the risk grew higher. People in the courtroom were starting to notice his questions. They were starting to wonder why this boy was so interested in the case. And some of them didn't like it. They didn't like how close Malik was getting to the truth. The danger was real now. Malik knew it. But he also knew that he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when he was so close to the truth. Every day in the courtroom felt like a battle. But Malik was determined to keep fighting. He wasn't just fighting for his father anymore. He was fighting for something bigger than himself. He was fighting for justice, for fairness, and for the truth. And no matter how hard the fight got, Malik wasn't going to give up. The day had arrived, the day when everything would change. Malik could feel it deep in his bones. The trial had been dragging on for weeks, and the air in the courtroom was thick with tension. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of false accusations, carefully constructed lies, and corruption that had festered for years. No one knew that the truth was about to come crashing down, especially not Malik's family. They had been waiting for this moment for so long, hoping against hope that one day, someone would hear their cries for justice. But no one had expected it to come from Malik. He stood there, small but resolute, facing the judge and the defense team. His father's life had been on the line for months, and the weight of that responsibility hung on Malik's young shoulders. But he was no longer afraid. He had seen enough, learned enough, and understood enough to know what had to be done. The court was full of people who believed they knew the truth: the jury, the lawyers, the spectators. They all thought the case was decided, that everything was in its place. But Malik had something they didn't. The moment was surreal. It was as if time had slowed down. Malik could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, the pounding of his pulse matching the rhythm of the courtroom. The judge, who had barely looked at him in the past, now fixed his eyes on Malik, a hint of something unfamiliar in his expression. The defense team, smug and confident moments before, was now watching him intently. The prosecutor, Mr. Douglas, was leaning forward, his eyes narrowed, expecting the usual end to the trial. But Malik was no longer the child they had dismissed so easily. He was no longer the boy who was invisible to them. He was the one holding the truth. Malik's voice broke the tense silence that had filled the room. His words were soft, almost hesitant at first, but they carried a weight that made every single person in the room stop and listen. "I know who did it." The room went dead silent. You could almost hear a pin drop. People exchanged confused glances, unsure of whether they had heard him correctly. The judge, who had been growing increasingly impatient with the trial, stood straighter, his attention fully on the young boy now. Even the defense attorney, Mr. Douglas, stopped sneering and turned his full attention to Malik. Malik stood there, calm and composed. His small hands were trembling ever so slightly, but his voice remained steady. There was no fear in his words, no doubt in his heart. He knew this was his moment. This was the moment when everything would change, when the truth would finally come to light. He slowly walked to the center of the courtroom. The defense team, especially Mr. Douglas, seemed to tower over him. But Malik wasn't intimidated. The more he focused on his goal, the more the world around him seemed to fade into the background. He had learned to fight for his family, for his father's innocence. And now, standing in front of everyone, he felt like he was fighting for something bigger, a fight for truth and justice. Malik's eyes locked onto Mr. Douglas, who watched him with a mocking smile. But Malik wasn't about to back down. His voice barely rose above a whisper, but it had the power of a storm. His words hit like a thunderclap, shocking the room into stillness. "You did it, Mr. Douglas." The words hung in the air, ringing louder than any gavel. There was a beat of stunned silence before the room exploded with confusion. Gasps echoed through the courtroom, and whispers spread like wildfire. People leaned forward in their seats, trying to comprehend what Malik had just said. But Malik wasn't finished yet. He had more to show them. He was about to reveal everything. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. His hand shook slightly, but he held it up high enough for everyone to see. The paper was important. It was the key to everything. And as soon as Malik held it up, the room seemed to freeze. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. The defense team exchanged frantic glances. Mr. Douglas's smirk faltered for the first time. He wasn't used to being caught off guard, but in that moment, it was clear that Malik had found something they never thought would be uncovered. Malik's voice remained calm, but it was filled with undeniable conviction. "This is a contract," he said, his voice echoing in the silence. "A contract that Mr. Douglas signed. He thought it would never be found. But here it is." The paper shook slightly in Malik's hand, but the moment it was shown to the courtroom, everything changed. Mr. Douglas's face paled, his mouth going dry. The smug expression that had always been there crumbled, replaced by a mixture of shock and panic. He stood frozen, unable to say a word. The courtroom buzzed with confusion and disbelief, but Malik remained silent, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. The contract was undeniable. It was a document that tied Mr. Douglas to a conspiracy that had been hiding in the shadows for years. Malik had uncovered the truth, piece by piece, and this was the final revelation, the thing that would bring everything to light. The contract was proof of a deal made long before the trial had even begun, a deal that connected Mr. Douglas to the false accusations against Malik's father. Malik had known all along that the case wasn't just about a crime, it was about something much bigger. There had been a conspiracy, a web of lies and deceit, and Mr. Douglas was at the center of it all. He had been manipulating the evidence, ensuring that certain facts were hidden, and orchestrating the entire trial to cover up his involvement. And now, in front of the judge, the defense team, and the jury, Malik had exposed it all. The lies had been uncovered, the corruption laid bare. There was no escaping the truth anymore. The room was in chaos. The judge stood, trying to regain control of the situation, but it was clear that the trial had been turned on its head. The defense team was no longer in control. The prosecutor, who had been so sure of his victory, was standing motionless, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The jury members exchanged looks of disbelief. They had believed in the narrative they were fed, but now, the truth was right in front of them. As the courtroom erupted into shouts and murmurs, Malik stood tall, feeling the weight of the moment. He had done it. He had not only saved his father, but he had also exposed a corruption that reached far beyond this trial. Malik had uncovered the lies that had been hidden in plain sight for years. And now, it was time for justice to be served. The judge, still recovering from the shock, finally spoke, his voice trembling with authority. "Mr. Douglas, you are hereby." But before the judge could finish, Mr. Douglas stood up, his face twisted with rage. "This is absurd," he shouted. "This is just a child's game. You can't believe him." But it was too late. The damage had been done. The evidence was clear. The contract, the lies, the manipulation, it all pointed to Mr. Douglas. And now, there was no way out. The truth had been revealed. Malik's heart raced in his chest as he watched Mr. Douglas falter. The room had erupted into chaos, but Malik didn't flinch. He stood there, unwavering, as the storm of shock and confusion swirled around him. He had exposed the man who had been behind the lies. He had done it for his father, for his family, for the truth. As Mr. Douglas was led out of the courtroom, handcuffed and defeated, Malik felt a sense of calm wash over him. His fight had been hard, but it had been worth it. The truth had won. The judge, now fully aware of the magnitude of what had just occurred, addressed the courtroom once more. "The charges against Mr. Johnson are hereby dismissed. This case is closed." It was a victory, but it was more than that. It was a moment of justice, of truth prevailing over lies, and of a young boy's determination changing the course of history. Malik had not just saved his father. He had shown everyone that no matter how small you are, no matter how impossible the odds, you can make a difference. As Malik walked out of the courtroom, his head held high, he knew this was just the beginning. There were still battles to fight, still truths to uncover. But for now, Malik had done what he set out to do. He had brought justice to his family. And that was enough. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, sharp and commanding. "Court is adjourned," Judge Blackwell said, his voice firm and unyielding. The words were simple, but their weight was immense. It was a moment that would go down in history, not just for the courtroom, but for Malik and his family. The moment they had been waiting for, the moment when the truth could no longer be hidden, the moment when their struggle finally had meaning. It was over. The courtroom, which had been filled with tension, erupted into chaos. People stood up, voices raised in surprise and disbelief. The lawyers whispered furiously among themselves, the jury exchanged glances of astonishment, and even the spectators, who had come to watch the trial unfold, were in a state of shock. The truth had come to light in a way none of them had expected. The false accusations, the manipulation, and the lies had all been shattered. The boy, Malik, had done what no one thought was possible. But amid the noise, Malik stood still. His feet were firmly planted on the ground. His heart raced, but his mind was clear. He had done what he came to do. There was no fear in him now. There was only the quiet confidence of a boy who had uncovered a truth that no one else had seen, and in doing so, had changed the course of everything. As the authorities moved quickly to arrest Mr. Douglas, the man who had orchestrated the lies and the corruption, the courtroom fell into stunned silence. It was as though everyone had collectively held their breath, waiting for the inevitable to happen. And then, just like that, it did. Mr. Douglas, once so powerful and self-assured, was now being led away in handcuffs. His arrogance had crumbled in the face of Malik's unwavering determination. The very man who had been behind the false accusations against Malik's father was now a prisoner of his own lies. Malik's family, who had sat through years of trials and heartache, could hardly believe what they were seeing. For so long, they had fought an uphill battle, each day more difficult than the last. They had been crushed by the weight of injustice, their lives upended by the corruption that had infiltrated their world. But now, as they looked at the events unfolding before them, they saw a new light. The truth was undeniable, and justice was finally being served. Malik's mother, who had never given up on her belief in her son, stepped forward, her eyes filled with tears of relief. She had watched her son grow into a young man who would not back down in the face of adversity. She had seen him stand tall when the world tried to push him down. Now, she was watching him stand tall once more, not as a child, but as a hero. "Malik, you did it," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Her heart swelled with pride as she looked at her son. Malik didn't say anything at first. He simply smiled at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. The battle had been long and difficult, but it was over now. His father, the man who had been unjustly accused and imprisoned for so long, was finally free. It was a victory, not just for Malik, but for his entire family. The weight of years of hardship, of false accusations and broken dreams, had been lifted in an instant. For the first time in a long time, they could breathe easy. And then, something incredible happened. The crowd in the courtroom, which had once been so hostile and full of judgment, began to change. As Malik walked out of the room with his parents by his side, something shifted. People moved aside, creating a path for him. It was as if the crowd had suddenly recognized the strength and courage Malik had shown, the power of his voice in the face of overwhelming odds. They parted, and as Malik passed by, he could feel their eyes on him. Some looked at him with awe, some with admiration, and some even with a new sense of respect. Judge Blackwell, who had once dismissed Malik as nothing more than a nuisance, now stood at the front of the room, his gaze following the boy and his family. There was no hint of the cold indifference that had marked his earlier treatment of Malik. Instead, there was something different in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, even respect. Malik had proven himself in a way no one could have imagined. The boy who had been ignored and underestimated had become the hero of the day. As Malik and his family walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the moment began to sink in. They had won. The fight was over. Malik had not just cleared his father's name, he had exposed a conspiracy, uncovered the truth, and brought justice to a system that had tried to silence them for so long. But Malik didn't feel the need for celebration. There was no grand show of triumph, no loud cheers or applause. Instead, there was a quiet sense of peace, of finality. He had done what he set out to do. The truth was out. Justice had been served. His family could finally move forward. As they stepped outside the courthouse, Malik felt the sun on his face, warm and comforting. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem so uncertain. There were still many challenges ahead, but for now, they could take a breath, knowing they had done everything they could. The moment felt like a new beginning. The past had been filled with pain and uncertainty, but now, they had the chance to rebuild. They could look forward to a future where the truth mattered, where justice wasn't just a dream but a reality. Malik's father, who had stood beside him through it all, placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Malik smiled back, a quiet sense of pride in his heart. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad," he said softly. And as the family walked away from the courthouse, surrounded by the buzz of a city that had been forever changed by their courage, Malik knew that this was only the beginning. There would be more battles to fight, more challenges to face, but they would face them together. With the truth on their side, they could face anything. As Malik and his family stepped out of the courthouse, the world outside seemed strangely calm. The buildings, the trees, the cars, they all seemed ordinary. But for Malik, everything had changed. The truth was finally out. The lies had been shattered, and his family no longer had to live in fear. No more whispers in the shadows, no more doubts about what had happened. The entire courtroom, and the people who had tried to silence them, would now have to reckon with the truth. The sun was bright, but not too hot. It was a perfect day, almost as if the world itself was breathing a sigh of relief. Malik felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't just the victory in the courtroom, it was the relief that came with knowing his family was finally free from the unjust system that had tried to break them. They had fought for so long, their lives turned upside down by a system that had cared more about power and control than truth and justice. But now, for the first time in years, they had a chance to start over. They walked through the streets, surrounded by people who didn't know their story. People who didn't know the pain they had endured or the battles they had fought. But it didn't matter. Malik didn't need them to understand. He didn't need the world to acknowledge his family's struggle. What mattered was that they had won. The truth was out, and the people who had caused so much harm were finally being held accountable. Malik's parents walked beside him, their faces filled with pride and relief. His mother's hand rested on his shoulder, a silent gesture of love and support. His father walked with a strong, steady gait, his shoulders no longer slumped under the weight of the false accusations that had haunted him for so long. For the first time in years, they felt like they could stand tall again. "Let's go home," Malik's father said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Malik nodded. He didn't need to say anything. Home. It was a word that had lost its meaning for so long, but now, it felt real again. It wasn't just a place. It was a feeling, a sense of safety and belonging. And for the first time, they would return to a place where they could rebuild their lives, free from the shadows of the past. As they made their way home, Malik couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led up to this moment. He thought about the days when he had first started to ask questions, when no one had believed that a boy his age could make a difference. He remembered the doubt in people's eyes when he'd stood up in the courtroom and spoken out. But now, all of that seemed so distant. The doubts, the challenges, the fears, they were all behind him. But Malik knew that this victory was not just about him. It was about his family. It was about the years of struggle, the tears, the pain, the heartbreak. His mother had cried herself to sleep many nights, wondering when the nightmare would end. His father had been locked away, accused of a crime he didn't commit, unable to defend himself. Malik had been just a child when it all started, but he had watched and learned. He had paid attention to the smallest details, the things others missed. And when the time had come, he had been ready. The more Malik thought about it, the more he realized how much he had grown. He wasn't the same boy who had walked into that courtroom all those days ago. He had become someone different, someone stronger, braver, and more certain of his place in the world. He had faced the darkest part of his life and had come out the other side. And now, he was no longer just a boy. He was a young man, someone who had proven that even in the face of injustice, one person could make a difference. When they arrived at home, Malik's parents hugged him tightly, their tears of relief mixing with the smiles on their faces. It was a moment of joy, but also a moment of silence. They had all lost so much in the years before this day, and now, they were finally free. Malik's father pulled back and looked at him, his eyes filled with pride. You did it, Malik. You saved our family. You gave us our lives back. Malik smiled, but his eyes were distant, as if he were thinking of something more. It wasn't just me, Dad. It was all of us. His mother kissed him on the cheek and nodded. You were brave, Malik. And you showed us all that even in the darkest moments, there's always hope. We never gave up, and neither did you. The house that once felt empty now seemed full. Full of hope, full of the promise of a new beginning. For the first time in years, Malik's parents felt a sense of peace they hadn't known in a long time. It wasn't just the end of the trial, it was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. Malik sat in his room later that evening, looking out of his window. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the fading light of the day marking the end of a chapter. As he sat there, he thought about all the people who had tried to tear his family apart. He thought about Mr. Douglas, the man who had lied and manipulated for years. But more than that, he thought about the future. The truth had won, and now they had the chance to build something new. It wasn't just about revenge or punishment. It was about redemption. It was about rebuilding their lives, their family, and their future. Malik didn't know what the future held, but he was no longer afraid. He had faced down one of the greatest injustices of his life and had emerged victorious. The journey had been long and hard, but he had learned something along the way. No matter how small or insignificant you might feel, you have the power to change the world. It starts with the truth. It starts with standing up for what's right. Malik lay back on his bed, looking at the ceiling. He thought about his mother's smile, his father's proud words, and the way the courtroom had felt when the truth finally came out. There was still so much to do, but for now, Malik was content. He had done his part. The rest would come in time. As he closed his eyes, a sense of peace washed over him. It wasn't just about winning the case. It was about proving that one voice could make a difference. And for Malik, that was enough. For now, it was enough. As Malik stepped out of the courthouse, the world around him felt different. The sun shone brightly, and the sky was clear, a perfect day, yet it felt like something inside him had shifted forever. It wasn't just the victory in the courtroom that made everything feel so significant. It was the truth, finally laid bare, the weight of everything that had been hidden for so long now lifted. Malik had done something that no one expected. The small, quiet boy in the courtroom had, with just a few words, changed everything. In that moment, he realized that even though he was young, even though people often underestimated him, he had the power to change the world. It was a lesson that had taken years to learn, a lesson that had been written in the pages of his family's struggle, in the quiet moments when he had watched and listened. The truth, after all, was a powerful thing. It could not be buried forever. And Malik had learned how to bring it to light. He looked over at his parents, walking beside him, their eyes filled with pride and love. His mother had tears in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, tears of joy, and tears of gratitude. His father, standing tall beside her, looked like a man who had just been given a second chance at life. Malik had given them both that gift. They no longer had to live in fear or shame. The truth had won, and it had freed them. But as they walked together, Malik couldn't help but think about all the people who were still fighting, all the people whose voices had been silenced, and all the people who had lost hope. He thought about the families who, like his, had been torn apart by lies and injustice. And he thought about how many of them might never get the chance he had. Malik had been lucky. He had found the courage to speak out. He had found the strength to face the truth, no matter how difficult it was. But so many others were still waiting for their moment, still hoping for someone to help them. He thought about what his mother had said, how she had always taught him to speak up for what was right, even when it seemed like no one would listen. And now, as he walked down the street, he knew that his actions had proven her right. Speaking the truth wasn't always easy. It wasn't always comfortable. But it was always worth it. No matter how small you are, no matter how young, your voice matters. In the courtroom that day, Malik had shown everyone that one person could make a difference. One voice could shake the very foundations of the world. One word could change everything. Don't let anyone silence your voice, Malik thought, walking out into the light. Even one word can change everything. As the family reached their car, Malik stopped for a moment, taking a deep breath. He knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead might still be long and difficult, but he had learned something important. He had learned that even in the darkest moments, there was always hope. And sometimes, all it took was a single spark to ignite change. His spark had been the truth, and it had burned brighter than anything else. He thought about the future, what it would hold for him and his family. They had been through so much, but they had made it through. They had been strong, and they had never given up. And now, they were free. Malik could only imagine the possibilities ahead of them. The future was wide open, full of new opportunities, full of hope. As he climbed into the car, Malik looked out the window and saw the world in a new light. He saw the people around him, the world they lived in, and the struggles they faced. He realized that, just like him, many of them were fighting battles they couldn't always win. But if they kept pushing forward, if they kept standing up for what was right, they, too, could make a difference. And with that thought in mind, Malik smiled. He knew that this was just the beginning of his journey. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but he was no longer afraid. He had already proven to himself that no matter how small you are, no matter how young, you could change the world. The car started moving, and Malik's thoughts began to drift. He thought about all the things he still wanted to do, all the changes he still wanted to see in the world. He thought about the people he could help, the stories he could tell, and the truth he could still uncover. He was ready. He had already made one big change, and he knew he could do more. Sometimes, the most unlikely people hold the power to change the world. A boy who no one took seriously had just turned the tide of an entire courtroom. And in that moment, Malik proved that no one is too small to stand up for the truth. Even when the world seems against you, even when everything is stacked up high, your voice can break through. Your voice can change the course of the story. And that, Malik thought, was the most important lesson of all. Even one word can change everything, Malik repeated to himself, feeling a sense of purpose deep inside. He had already made history today. He had already proven that courage, truth, and perseverance mattered more than anything else. And that, no matter what the world told him, his voice would always be heard. As the car drove down the street, Malik looked out at the world, knowing that he had made a difference. And no one, no matter how powerful, could ever take that away from him. The truth had won. And Malik had been the one to bring it to light.